What is your reaction to the strike by the Israelis on what is termed a refugee camp?
I was shocked by that strike on the Jabalia refugee camp and the deaths of many civilians. We don't exactly have the exact figures yet, but I watched it last evening. Whole families destroyed, killed. Fathers talking about losing their children. It's horrific and it's not justifiable. And in our view, it adds pressure to the need to have a humanitarian pause here, a humanitarian ceasefire to enable aid to get in.
Now there are people struggling with that difference between a pause and a ceasefire. The Israelis say no ceasefire, the British say no ceasefire, the US says no ceasefire. They are contemplating pausing. And there is a significant difference in the two from the Israeli perspective.
There is indeed. And in fact, the United Nations resolution, which we supported last week, called it a humanitarian truce or a truce. And I understand Israel has the right to go after Hamas and to deal with Hamas. There is an issue of proportionality here, because when you bomb a refugee camp, which is a town in itself of long duration, it's there for many decades, there's no doubt many civilians will be killed, children will be killed, and I do not believe it was a proportionate attack last evening in any shape or form, and that's where there's a real issue. Israel will identify, and I understand, will say a ceasefire means we can't go after Hamas. Of course, Hamas would have to declare a ceasefire as well, and people forget that they're still sending rockets and so on across the border. But the pressure is so great on the civilian population now, and the United Nations agencies are saying to us that this is a catastrophe, a human catastrophe happening before our very eyes, that it demands a pause in the initial phase. Nobody is saying that Israel does not have a right to go after Hamas after the murder of
they have
so many Israeli civilians.
They've maintained that they killed a key Hamas leader, and also by hitting that particular target, that they collapsed the tunnels that were beneath that target, and therefore they degraded Hamas's ability to respond and indeed to hide. That question of proportionality is a very difficult one, because they are permitted, it appears, under the rules of war, even to target a hospital if people are being deliberately used as human shields, which it seems an extraordinary provision, but they are quoting it in their own support.
I think there's a moral question, there's a legal question. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, who are very clear that they have jurisdiction in the Middle East, ultimately decides on what constitutes a war crime or not. But in my view, what is Israel saying? That if we take out a commander of Hamas and some underground tunnels, that's worth how many hundred lives? Is that the moral question that's been put before us? I'm very clear on what side I'm on in that you cannot knowingly take out hundreds of civilians who are not Hamas because of the cowardly and unacceptable and illegal use of civilians as human shields. I mean, Israel is a state. It's a democratic state. We do expect higher standards from states as opposed to non-state actors generally. The rules of war apply to both state and non-state actors. And by any yardstick, if you watch the scenes at the refugee camp last evening, where mothers and fathers were emerging, one man saying, "All my children are dead. All my children are dead." It's horrific. And there has to be proportionality applied here through a moral lens.
Opinion used to be pretty divided in Israel about the conduct of the Netanyahu government. But what happened earlier with the incursion by Hamas, they lost in the process, it seems, 1,000 of their volunteers, many of whom were prepared to die for the cause. But in Israel, where the equivalent to happen here by comparison of populations, we would have lost 800 Irish people on the day. We would have lost maybe 150 people at Electric Picnic, if you put it in that way.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that helps to understand perhaps the anger that has unified Israel, and how perhaps normally moral people overlook what their government is doing.
I fully understand that point, and I was very clear at the beginning of all of this to identify that and to reflect on that this is the Hamas attack not only was it barbaric, but the scale of it in the context per capita of Israel was huge. I think someone at a European Council meeting said it was equivalent to 10,000 French people being killed.
50,000 Americans.
Yeah, so that is enormous, and we've got to understand that. And there have been times when that hasn't been understood. And in all of the talks I've had with various foreign ministers in the region, they do understand that. And for us who are some distance from it, we obviously want to move to a more rational, strategic approach as to how to deal with this. Whereas if you are living in Israel, you are very, very angry with what has happened because the deeds were quite barbaric in terms of how people were killed, and children and so forth, and elderly people. And these were all civilians going about their normal lives. So we can't underestimate the impact on the Israeli psyche, and that is leading to what is a very, very strong military incursion into Gaza and bombardment of Gaza. But then what emerges from that then is the enormous suffering of Gazans.
Does Ireland have any role to play on its own? I mean, we have a history ourselves of armed insurrection at various points throughout our history. We have the Provisional IRA terrorism campaign that went on, and on the other side also. And of course, British Army collusion and security force collusion. We've had all of that in our history. Is there anything about us that can act as honest brokers, be helpful, or would we be better off speaking with the voice of the EU?
I think we work within the European Union. We speak independently. So, for example, at the United Nations resolution, Europe didn't vote as a bloc, and there were about 8 EU member states who supported the resolution. The key component of that resolution was to seek a humanitarian truce to allow aid to get in. So that's one aspect of Ireland's, and we work within the European Union to bring others to our viewpoint, which is that in any conflict like this, a military solution on its own is not going to suffice. That there has to be a multidimensional approach to this. There has to be a political track. There has to be a humanitarian track. And there has to be talks at some stage. Because one fears now that what's happening in Gaza will create new generations of radicalism and hardline. And we saw that in the early 1970s in Ireland.
So even if they eliminate Hamas, there'll be a Hamas too, or provisional Hamas,
that would be my sense, yeah. And that given the suffering that people are now enduring in Gaza, that's very much a possibility, if not a likelihood.
Speaking to Duncan Bullivant this morning, he was saying that the Israeli tactic is to basically exhaust the arsenal of Hamas. They'll have exhausted all their rockets that they've pegged into Israel. Their ammunition will be either destroyed or inaccessible to them. And that's what they're after. And that's why they don't want a ceasefire yet. They haven't reached that point.
I think that's a fair assessment. And I think there's no doubt that there will be a military impact here on Hamas, and that Hamas's capacity, I think, will be severely dented as a result of this. That would be my understanding. I'm not a military expert, but ultimately, where does all this lead to? And I think fundamentally it has to lead to a political track where there's once and for all a determined attempt to try and resolve the fundamentals of creating a Palestinian state that lives in harmony alongside the state of Israel.
Can you see that coming about with Netanyahu as Prime Minister?
I don't see it coming about in the short term, regrettably. Although I do sense internationally a collective view that we cannot let things continue in the aftermath of this, as was happening before this. And there was a sense that the two-state solution had run into the sand, so to speak. It wasn't going anywhere. And meanwhile, you had the settlements in the West Bank, and that was getting more extreme. Again, there was greater degree of displacement of Palestinians on the West Bank. And all of that was really, if you like, making the whole idea of a two-state solution somewhat non-viable. And I think we need to restore that to some degree. But in the meantime, I think what we have to focus on is the humanitarian plight of those living in Gaza.
It's very hard to see the geographic outlines of a two-state solution, given the Strip is here and the West Bank is over there, and there is no link. There's no.
Yeah,
boundary.
I've just come back from there. I was out there for about 4 days before this outbreak. It was quite depressing leaving there because the situation was clearly becoming worse. The Palestinian Authority did not have the same authority perhaps as it once had within the West Bank itself. So the situation is not good, in terms of trying to create something out of this that would be strong and viable ultimately. But we have to try, and we have to focus on dialogue on a political track, and also to bring forward the voices of moderation within the Palestinian political world, because I think to a certain extent policies were undermining the Palestinian Authority and moderation within Palestinians, which allowed extremists like Hamas come to the fore and do their bloody deeds, which have now plunged the whole situation into an appalling, catastrophic situation for Gazans and for people more generally across the Middle East. And then there's the regional potential of escalation.
And our troops are working there, serving there in the region, and they will be replaced as normal. There's no holding back.
There will be, yeah. I mean, we're part of a wider UNIFIL operation with thousands of troops from countries all over the world who are present in Lebanon. It's led by a Spanish force commander at the moment, and Spain and Italy have strong contingents as well. With Ireland from a EU perspective, and we're with a Polish contingent in Irish Palbat. So I reviewed troops yesterday who will be moving out to replace those who are already there. Our job is to keep the peace. Our job is to look after civilians in the event of any increased escalation.
But we are committed to the UNIFIL operation. I mean, that's what we're there for. If the going gets tough, we're not going to get going out of there. We're going to stay.
Yeah, that is it. I mean, and obviously we work with UNIFIL and the United Nations in this respect. We've been here before in terms of the 70s and in terms of the early 2000s. When there was war going on and so forth. So it's something we don't want to see, of course. And we're working, and again, part of the conversations I've been having, and there's general consensus that everything must be done to try and avoid regional escalation in Lebanon or elsewhere.